Okay, I think some people already here. We should get started with our guest today, Arik Rudnitzky. I want to thank, first of all, Schusterman Center and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for helping me organize this meeting. I want to take 1 minute to introduce Arik, and then he will talk to us around 30 to 35 minutes. And before everyone leaves, we will have like 15 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes for a Q&A session. Arik, can you hear us?
Sure. Hi, everybody.
Yes, good.
Hi, Ahmad. I'm sorry. Can you just take a moment to introduce yourself?
Oh.
In case people
okay, I am Ahmad Igbaria. I am a lecturer here, a fellow of the Israeli Institute. I teach the history of the Middle East in general, and specifically Israel-Palestine history. This is my first year at UT as a lecturer. That's all, I think, about me. Okay. Now, Arik is a lecturer at the Department of Middle Eastern Studies and African History at Tel Aviv University. He's also a researcher at the Moshe Dayan Center, also at Tel Aviv University. He is an expert, an Israeli expert on the national and social changes in the Arab society, as well as government policies toward Arabs in Israel. I know Arik since I started my undergraduate years at Tel Aviv University, and he is an expert in Arabic and he speaks Arabic very well. He has published a few articles, and he finished his dissertation in 2019, I think. And some of my students here in this group actually read one of his articles at least. He published a few others, like the Arab minority in Israel and the discourse on the Jewish state, published in 2015 in the Israeli Democratic Institute in Jerusalem. So today we will have Arik to talk to us about the critical years between 1948 until 1966. These years, the Arab minority were placed under the military government, and Arik will talk about these 20 or 17 years through what he calls the cinematic works. Arik.
Thank you, Ahmad, and thank you, everybody, for joining us from which part on the globe you're located at. Good evening here from Israel. I did all this effort to be here with you today, and I'm really delighted, Ahmad. Thank you again for inviting me for this talk. Well, I have to say that one of the fascinating things that really interests me is the connection between past events and the way we perceive them at present. And also the way we perceive them in present, how does this way changes over time. And actually what I'm going to focus during my quite short lecture here is to try to demonstrate using two case studies and to demonstrate how the perception of the Arab minority in Israel towards itself on past events has changed over time. Now, without further ado, I would like to share with you my presentation, which I prepared for this meeting. And I hope that everybody can see us and see this presentation. So I want to discuss today the way that the past has been reconceptualized, or how did present events affect the way Arabs perceive their collective memory of the past. Now, first, just to present you basic timelines in the history of the Arab minority in Israel. Now, introducing the timeline. I'm going to locate 4 points here across this timeline, and I believe that these 4 points make sense for everybody here. The first is in 1948, the second is 1967, the third is 1993, and the fourth, which is quite new, is 2011. Now, each historical milestone has its own title. 1948 is the year of the Nakba, then came 1967, the Six-Day War, then came the 1993 Oslo Accords, and the relatively most recent in historical terms is the Arab Spring events of the 2011-2012 year. Now, each milestone actually represents the beginning of a new era of the way Arabs perceive themselves. For instance, the period between 1948 and 1967 is considered to be the period of so-called Israelization or accommodation, where the Arab minority accommodated itself to living in the state of Israel. The next period between 1967 and 1993, Arabs in Israel rediscovered the Palestinian brethren in the 1967 territories, and actually this period of time is signaled or is marked by the strengthening of the Palestinian collective identity of the Arab minority. Then came the 1993 Oslo Accords, which marked for the Palestinians in Israel that they have to take care of their own fate within the Jewish state self-defined. And then came yet another milestone in 2011, which actually marked the collapse of the Arab back, or the moral or the cultural back from the Arab world. But I want to focus my talk on this period, the period under discussion. The military government period between 1948 and 1966, and here we can add several additional milestones when we zoom in into this period. Beginning in 1948, most significant milestone, the next milestone was in 1956 Kufr Qasim massacre. I don't know if you've heard about that or discussed it in class, but it was a significant and important event in itself. Then came the events of 1958 and 1959, affected by the union between Egypt and Syria. Then came to we heard for the first time of the emergence of a small group named Al-Ard, the Land, the nationalist movement, which was actually the first nationalist organization within the Green Line at the time. And then our final point here is the 1966, when the military government actually came to an end, and shortly after, the 1967 Six-Day War. Now, this is a period under discussion. A common wisdom is that the Arab minority or Arab society at the time was weak, was under the oppression of the defeat, the 1948 Nakba, a submissive minority which actually accepted without any resistance government policies and actually allowed the military government to sustain and be in power for almost 2 decades, right? Well, I want to discuss here in my lecture to use 2 case studies and to question whether there was a resistance or not. And number 2 is how the Arab minority over time looks back to government policies that were implemented on it in the period under discussion. But as I mentioned before, what we know from this period is pictures like that. You see here, like pictures from the archive. This is a representative picture of a ceremony, a welcome ceremony of the military governor in al-Fahim. By the way, Ahmad, not that far from your hometown, in the Triangle region. Similar views we see in such large villages as Taibe in the central district of Israel. You see how the military governor is located in the middle. You see all the so-called the Shuyukh al-Balad, all the notable Arab notable surround him. And also you see pictures like this in elsewhere, not that far from Al-Fakhem, from Kalansawa. You see that the military governor is taking care of all order, and all the Arab inhabitants actually are just standing there, observing, passive. Now, I want to raise the first question about the issue of resistance. Now, we know, or we all know, that the question, the way we perceive historical events has to a large extent to do with the way we perceive present events. Now, there's the past, or what we think about the past, and as we get more and more closer to the present, there is the interpretation of the past, and this is actually how an historiography is created. Now, I believe that you all heard about maybe you read my article about the Zionist group and the post-Zionist scholars and the post-Zionists. Probably you've heard about the new historians, the way of the new historians at the late of the 80s, and then the counter-historiography that emerged in the 90s and later on. Now, this all has to do with the past and the way we distance ourselves from it. But one thing is clear, that 1948 is still there under discussion. Now, to illustrate, case study number one, the question of resistance. So, what do you think? Was there a resistance among the Arab citizens or not? What do scholars tell us about this? I would need the help of the historical timeline. You see the 1948 point. This is the beginning of our discussion. And then we go on later through the 80s and 90s and so on. Now, the first wave of historiography back in the 80s actually accepted the fact that the Arab minority was submissive and weak, as reflected in the work of Tom Segev, which is, by the way, considered to be one of the first new historians. He wrote that many of the Arabs at the time were rural and backward, not so political word to use, but anyway, he used it. And then he said that they were under the impression of defeat, and he concludes that they did not pose any danger to the security state, to the security of the state. Later on, we had similar conclusions by Azmi Bishara in the early 90s, saying that the Palestinian population in Israel after 1948 was a defeated remnant of a defeated society. And then came Dani Rabinovich and Khala Abubakar in their book, in the 2002 book, saying that actually the generation after the 1948 war should be termed and called the generation of survivors. They could not do anything about it. They just had to survive and to accept the reality. Now, I think that you can see how has the historiography evolved over time. But interesting to see is the counter-historiography wave manifested first by Ahmad Saadi's work. Well, he said the following. He said that actually there was a resistance. It was a cultural resistance. The Palestinians in Israel developed a form of a cultural resistance which allowed them to choose what to accept and what to reject from their new Israeli citizenship and their relation with the state. A decade later came Hillel Cohen with his notable book, Good Arabs, saying that this is quite a revolutionary conclusion, saying that the 1948 generation actually exceeded the pre-1948 generation in the scope of its resistance. How come? For instance, he says that the fact that the Arab population grew by 15%, meaning that the Arab inhabitants after 1940 actually absorbed, infiltrated, and actually made the state to accept them as new citizens. This was a demonstration of, or manifestation of some kind of resistance to the new regime. Anyway, Hillel Cohen says that it was not a balance of power, that all the power was concentrated on one side and not on the other side. Actually, it was quite a game of balance of power between the two sides. Then came Maha Nassar's work based on a PhD dissertation. She said that, and she examined newspapers in Arabic, and especially Al-Ittihad newspaper, reflecting the line of the Israeli Communist Party in the first decade, and she found that there were many references to the charge issue of refugee return to the pre-1948 borders. Now, this in itself demonstrates the fact that the Arab minority was not so submissive, and they did not accept the fact that they were a minority for the long term. Okay, if you are still unsatisfied and don't believe me, hear what Sabri Giris said in an interview in 2017. Sabri Giris, he was one of the Al-Ard nationalist movement. He says the following: well, Israel felt the danger reflected in the Al-Ard movement. And then he continues, in hindsight, we understand that the Al-Ard movement wasn't an isolated phenomenon. It represented the start of the Palestinian awakening and a renewed gathering of the pieces of Palestinian national identity, which had been shattered by the Nakba. These attempts began to be made simultaneously in both the homeland, that is the green line, and in the diaspora. So actually, when you hear Sabri Giris' opinion in 2017, looking back on what was taking place in the late 50s, he said that this was the sign of a new Palestinian identity under military government rule. So if we see the timeline and you see how do these two historiography currents actually developed, historiography approaches develop, you see that as we move forward in time, there is great or more deeper look into the past. You see that, by the way, if you try to categorize the works of the scholars, you see that while the first wave based their arguments on common wisdom, on what they knew from past generation, actually the new historiography here bases their arguments on archival material. And this is important. Now, I want to demonstrate here this question of resistance. And if you think that the first time that this question was raised actually in the late 19th, I want to use the example of Palestinian cinematic work. And here I want to take, for example, the work by Michel Khleifi in his film, in his notable film, Wedding in Galilee. This was actually the first feature film produced by a Palestinian Arab film director. Michel Khleifi was born in Nazareth in 1950, meaning that he was born a short time after 1948, and it actually lived as a young boy and a young adult the life under military government. So this film deals with the Arabs' reality of life under military government rule. Now, we don't have enough time to watch the film or watch the clip, but in a nutshell, the plot is very simple. Here comes the Mukhtar, he is the leader of the village, and with the simple goal. He wants to have his son's wedding during this month. He comes to the military governor refuses, and then the military governors decide that, well, if you want to hold your son's wedding, you have to invite me, the military governor, to the wedding. So the Mukhtar has to agree. So this is quite a simple plot. But what is interesting here is what actually takes place later on in the film. Now, the Mukhtar comes back to his village, and then you see the gathering of all the shuyukh, the notable Arab, or the notables of the village at the time. And he rises with all his authority, saying that, well, the military governor and his officers asked to come. A sharp debate is being ignited in the room, and other voices say that, well, they are not welcome at all. Why should they come? Some kind of a resistance, which is quite surprising at the time. But later on in the movie, and this is the new thing here, we see a discussion between young persons in the village saying that this is actually an opportunity for an attack to kill the military governor. To kill the military governor. Hey, this is the military governor period. So what we see here is actually a first reference to the notion of resistance. Now, what is important to understand here that feature film are cultural representation of a general mood within the society. This feature film was created in 1987. 1987, the charged period of Palestinization, later on the Intifada. So we can understand that what Michel Khleifi is doing is trying to reopen the military government file and to represent or present from a different angle the reality of life for a proactive orientation by the Arab inhabitants at the time. Now, this is one case study. Another case study, which I want to use for the next closing minutes that I have for this presentation, is to discuss the way how do Arabs today perceive in retrospect state policies that were implemented on the Arab minority at the time. Now, for this purpose, I will use, I wish time could afford, but I will use one clip to demonstrate from the notable feature film by Ilya Suleiman, The Time That Remains. Pay attention to the year it was released, 2009. So it is almost a decade after the second Intifada, an intensified conflict between Israel and the Palestinian, an intensified discussion about the Palestinian national identity of the Arab minority within Israel. We have to take this into consideration. Ilya Suleiman was born a decade after Michel Khleifi in Nazareth, and this film actually presents an autobiography of sorts of the producer, of the director life. From 1948, by the way, he was born in 1960. So it presents how the collective memory of the Arabs in Israel at the time, from 1948 up to present days. Now, we are going to watch a short clip from the movie, and I want you to think of 2 points while watching this clip. The first point is, what role does the Arab education system play at the time? And later on, try to think what happens on the beach at night. Now, with your permission, I will just stop share this presentation and share with you the clip. Don't go anywhere. And the clip is right here. I will share the sound. 6.5 minutes. Here it is.
אני גאה ומאושר להעניק למקהלה הנפלאה של בית הספר את הפרס הראשון בתחרות הזמר העברי. פרס זה, שניתן לבית ספר מבני המיעוטים, מהווה סימן נוסף על רצוננו להלחין את עקרונות הדמוקרטיה והשוויון לתלמידינו. גברתי המנהלת, בבקשה.
¿Sabían que no hay que ocurrir en el ها؟ مين؟ انت بتعرف انه هذا حكي ما حكاش بالصف.
كنا بنخفف دخان نمطط مشاوير صيد بالليل.
בסדר? מצוין. איפה החבר'ה? נצרת. כל הדרך מנצרת? לא קרה לכם לבוא לדוג בלילה? לא. לפחות תגיד, יש. יש. תעודת זהות, יש. יש. טוב, תעשו חיים.
Okay, guys. So in just a short clip, I think that we have, in a very concise way, you see the perception of looking backward at time, how government policies were perceived and the way they're treated and digested today in retrospect. I think that you cannot ignore the way, the cinematic way, how director Ilyas Suleiman actually mocks the military government and the role played by education system trying to create a new identity of Israelis of Arab origin, so to speak. Now, this actually represents what happened in the past, because I have many Arab friends that said that, well, this is it. Even the songs were true, and it really reflects the zeitgeist. Meaning that the feeling of the time, of the period of time back then in the 50s and 60s. Now, to conclude our discussion, to conclude our discussion, we don't have enough time to watch the second part of the movie. The second clip, we will have to leave it for our next time we meet over Zoom. But I think that what my purpose in this short lecture was to present the connection between the present and past. And I want to conclude with this is an old Soviet joke saying that future is certain. It is the past that is so unpredictable. This is actually why we so much enjoy reading the past and studying the past, and understand how do past events actually move the wheels of present situation and how it is connected to current affairs and current events. Thank you guys for the time and patience. Ahmad, I think I did it on time as required. So 35 minutes, just on time. No, this is the way we do it always in Israel. We are very accurate and precise.
Thank you, Arik, very much for this an incredible presentation. I was amazed with your using of these, pictures and using this video clip from a movie that I watched many years ago. I want to open the floor here for discussions and the questions. We have around like 15 minutes before you go. From my students first, if you have any questions, concerns, or comments about that movie or what to Arik.
I would have a question.
Okay, please, Elijah.
Yes, thank you so much. It was an amazing lecture, but I do have one question for you. Is there any evidence of resistance increasing specifically following acts of extreme trauma between 48 and 66? So most notably, following the 1956 Kfar Qasim massacre, did we see an increased level of resistance specifically following those events? If that question makes sense.
It does make sense. And what is interesting here is that there are no evidence about an actual resistance. We do not forget the facts, and the fact that it was hard time for the Arabs who actually tried to move or navigate the way in the new state. It was a weak minority, but in retrospect, some scholars or some cultural representation tried to highlight the cultural resistance and to elevate it to a level of a resistance in itself. Now, actually, they did their most to preserve their own cultural and identity. Yes. So this is, in a sense, it is a form of a resistance. But of course, there was no armed resistance prior to 1967. Yes, I see a question for Greg.
Yes, excellent presentation. Thank you. I just wanted to comment. I thought when the boy threw away the lentils and the mother concurred that it said so much about what you have been discussing in the presentation, but it said it artistically and in the cinema. I thought it was wonderful.
Yeah. So you want me to comment about that, or?
Just an observation,
No.
or if that's you know, your take on it. Yeah.
Well, you know, one interesting thing is that the boy is actually Ilya, and young Ilya, and the boy doesn't speak at all. Now, does this ring a bell? Do you happen to know a Palestinian boy that does not speak at all and is only an observant of the events? Have you heard about the
unusual?
Maybe, okay. Have you heard about the iconic image of Handale? Handale, Ahmad, maybe, I don't know if you mentioned this icon, but there was a Palestinian comic, Najil Ali, and he created the icon of Handale, the Palestinian refugee boy that is actually says nothing and only observes the present events. So this is what Ilya Suleiman tried to convey, that he was there to see, he could do nothing about that, but he does not forget. Yes, Alexander, please.
So you mentioned how Israel was controlled by a military, not occupation, but like a military control between 1948 and 1966. What did that entail for the Arabs living in the land?
What is that again? The question, please.
So you talked about how there's military control in Israel from 1948 to 1966. What did that mean for Arabs? Like, how did that look like for Arabs in that society?
For instance, they had to receive a permit to leave certain zones and to enter other zones in certain hours of the day. So they could not leave at night. And this is a significant issue because, for instance, consider the education level of girls at the time. Now, many girls were uneducated. They could not actually gain the necessary education or schooling because they could not leave like villages where there were no school and to move to other villages. Only the boys were allowed actually to leave because of the conservative type of the Arab family. So given this regime of permits, to leave and to enter, it did have an effect on the structure of society. By the way, today is completely different. I'm upside down because the most educated segment are girls in our society. Yes, Gil, please.
Yes, so I was just about to ask about that. So what do you think led to the kind of liberalization of Arab society in Israel, where now a lot of doctors in Israel are Arabs and also a lot of them are women and a lot of nurses are. So what led to that?
Today?
Yes. What led to the liberalization of, I guess, the Arab society in Israel? Was it the fact that there were, I guess, was it due to like the military rule, like Alex said, or what led to those events?
I think we have to differentiate between the legacy of the military rule or the military government and current developments. Now, current developments are a bit out of scope here, but in general, well, we have done a long way since the 50s and 60s, and today Arab society is a large society, a large minority, 2 million inhabitants, and there was the wave of liberalization in the Israeli society in general through the 90s. However, the legacy of the military government is always there, blinking like a spot in the past. And I think what is relevant to the topic of this of this lecture is the way they try to digest and reconceptualize the past in order not to remember themselves as so submissive and weak.
Thank you.
I would ask my question, Arik.
Fadal.
Okay, so so first of all, so between 1948 and 1966, we actually didn't see any substantial resistance. The only resistance to the Israeli government was basically cultural resistance. My first question is, can you actually elaborate on that? How you actually resist military rule, you know, through culture? What means do you have in order to resist? But also how this differs from millennial generations, like in Israel. Now you work with millennials. I know that you have so many friends like from this generation. How they today resist all sorts of laws that discriminate against Arabs, Jewish institutions that try to, exclude Arabs. So we have different norms of resistance. Can you talk about this a little bit?
Okay, thank you, Ahmad. If we focus on the period under discussion, I think that, well, the fact that Palestinian identity was always there. It just waited for the proper timing to come out. And the proper timing was the 1967 war that erased the dividing line between Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line, the Muslim culture, the Arab culture in general. Now, see, for example, the education system. Now, the state failed to create a new type of an Israeli of Arab origin. This is for sure. I think this is a fact. Otherwise, you cannot explain how strong the Palestinian identity emerged through the late 60s and 70s and the identification with the PLO and the Palestinian people. So in terms of cultural resistance, of course, they did not have the power. They have to cooperate with the regime. Even the elderly people, the leaders of the villages that were once considered to be as collaborators with the regime, now the attitude is more forgiving. Well, they did their most to preserve and to protect Arab society as it was under the 1948 defeat. This is important to understand. I think today things are completely different because first, Israel has run through a process of liberalization since the late 80s and 90s. And one thing is, what you see a profound change in the Arab society is the emergence of a strong civil society that actually uses any field of action available in this Israeli citizenship. And the situation is not that bad. Well, it is not that bad as it sounds. Still, there are some tools that can be used to fight for equality. First and foremost, the legal arena. I think many Arab CSOs actually struggle to promote and advance the interest of the Arab society through legal petitions, for instance.
I'm really surprised that you are saying the situation is not bad for Israeli Arabs who...
No, it is not that bad, of course. Well, this is a political question, as you know. We can discuss this question, but it depends. I don't want to go further into politics. Of course, it depends on the point of view.
Right. Karen?
Yes, Karen.
Hi, Arik. Thank you for your talk. I wanted to ask kind of, I think, a follow-up question to what Ahmad asked about the cultural resistance in particular. I find it always so interesting. I study literature, I'm a literary scholar. And I know that literary scholars like to take films and to read messages into them as we read literary texts. And sometimes it can be very useful. And I think that the examples that you brought in the clip that you showed really put into perspective this question of memory and how memory shapes and is shaped by people. But I also think that we have to take them with a grain of salt, because cultural products like films are the product of the imagination, and they can be a space of fantasy. They don't necessarily reflect exactly what the society that produces them is sort of experiencing. So they could be one filmmaker's reaction, which could be, again, a sort of a fantasy, and it's an imaginative reaction. So that's one thing that because when you showed the sort of the images from the first film, you sort of positioned it as reflective of the mood, the general mood of the society at that time, which maybe it is. But I also wanted to throw something else into the mix, which is that with film, maybe more than any other cultural product, and especially when you're looking at Palestinian film, you have a lot of other actors engaged in the production of these films, in the financing of these films. And many of these actors are international actors. There's a lot of European support, for example, for Palestinian films. Suleiman in particular is sort of the darling, the Palestinian darling of international cinema. And I just wondered if there was any way to take that into account, and what that might suggest also about your use of films. And it's really a question about method, I think. About your use of films to sort of bolster this interpretation of history.
Now, this is an excellent introduction for our next hour of discussion, because you actually are opening a Pandora box. But I'm a historian. I do not research cinematic works from like an artistic point of view. And what interests me is the circumstances under which this film was actually born. Now, one film was created or released in 1987. So meaning that it was in the head of the director a couple of years. And I know that Michel Khleifi, before releasing The Wedding in the Galilee, had some attempts to produce a feature film. So this is, I think, another contribution to the not academic, but I would say the cultural discourse about how people shape their collective memory. Then came Ilya Suleiman, and his film was released in 2009. Now, I see the periods of time and try to understand the surrounding circumstances that actually gave birth to this actually artistic creation. Of course, we have to take into consideration that actually both films were not released in Israel. They're released outside of Israel. And they have only English subtitles, which of course is a benefit to you, but so you got my point. But what is interesting me is to take these cultural representation, and I think that you cannot ignore that the cinematic creations are cultural representation of a society. Like this is a completion. You need to complete the picture, not only on the academic dry level, but also a sense of something else that actually represents the society that you try to understand. I think this is the benefit of such feature films.
Okay. Any other questions, last comments before we actually conclude this event? Okay, then I don't see any hands. Thank you, Arik. Thank you, everyone, for coming today to listen to this talk about Israeli Arabs in the early years of the formation of the State of Israel. I hope that many students of mine will benefit a lot from these things. We're gonna discuss them in class as well. If you have any questions, anything, you just write me, or I can write to Arik if you want. And thank you very much. Thank you. I'll see you Wednesday.
Thank you for the time and patience.